The airshaft was the lungs of the building, though they rarely breathed clean air. In the Lower East Side of Manhattan, 1912, the buildings were tall, narrow, and pressed tightly against one another, forming deep brick canyons where the sunlight struggled to reach the pavement for more than a few hours a day. Inside these structures, life was lived in layers, stacked upon one another with thin walls that offered little privacy. For the residents of 97 Orchard Street, the courtyard below was a communal space, but the airshaft windows were the eyes into the soul of the neighbors. Arthur Penelgon lived on the 4th floor, facing the back. He was a man of quiet habits, a clerk in a maritime insurance office down by the docks. He spent his days calculating risk and loss, meticulously entering figures into heavy ledgers with a nib pen. He was 32, with a face that was beginning to settle into the lines of a man who worked hard and rested little. His world was defined by the predictable rhythm of the ferry bell, the scratch of his pen, and the solitude of his rented room. Directly across the airshaft, in the adjacent building that looked identical to his own, lived Eleanor Vance. She worked in the garment district, operating a sewing machine for 10 hours a day. Her fingers were often stained with ink and pricked by needles, her eyes tired from the strain of matching intricate patterns. She was 28, possessed of a practical beauty that the city tried hard to erode, but failed. She was reserved, keeping her thoughts locked behind a polite demeanor that she presented to the world. They were, in the language of the tenements, enemies at court. The court was the airshaft, a narrow gap of sky and brick that forced them into an unwilling intimacy. In the heat of summer, when the city became a pressure cooker of humidity and rotting garbage, the windows had to stay open. The sounds of one life spilled into the other, the heavy cough of Arthur's landlord, the rhythmic clacking of Eleanor's machine as she finished piecework late into the night, the arguments of couples, the crying of infants. Initially, their relationship was one of friction. Arthur valued silence above all else. After a day of shouting dockworkers and clanging typewriters, Eleanor, exhausted and overworked, needed to let the steam out of her small room, often singing low, mournful folk songs, or scrubbing her floor with vigorous energy that echoed against the bricks. Arthur would close his window with a snap, a clear signal of his annoyance. Eleanor would see the gesture and pause, her face hardening in the dim lamplight before she resumed her work with defiant volume. They were strangers separated by 20 feet of empty space, divided by the unspoken rules of territory and peace. But time, much like the city, has a way of wearing things down until they fit together. The friction softened into a ritual. The first true shift happened not in the summer, but in the deep chill of November. A heavy snowfall had muted the city, blanketing the grime of the streets in white. The steam radiators in both buildings were clanking and hissing, providing heat that was inconsistent at best. Arthur returned home one evening, shivering in his heavy wool coat. He lit the gas lamp, the yellow light flickering against the wallpaper. He went to the window to close the heavy drapes when he noticed the light across the way. Eleanor was sitting at her small table, her head in her hands. The gaslight in her room was turned low, and through the thin glass, the silence seemed to vibrate. She looked defeated, the weight of the city's demands visible in the curve of her shoulders. Arthur paused. His hand rested on the window frame. He did not close his curtains. Instead, he sat in his wooden chair, a respectful distance from the glass, and began to read his newspaper. He did not look at her directly. He merely offered his presence, a stillness in the chaotic world. Across the gap, Eleanor sensed the change. The angry snaps of the window were gone. She looked up and saw Arthur, his profile illuminated by the lamp. He was reading, calm and steady. There was no intrusion, only a quiet acknowledgement that they were both there, fighting the same lonely battle. She took a breath, wiped her eyes, and returned to her mending. The silence between them that night was not empty. It was full of understanding. From then on, their routines became synchronized. In the mornings, the alarm clocks would ring within moments of each other. Arthur would rise and shave, the splash of water audible in the quiet dawn. Eleanor would be at her mirror, pinning up her hair. They would arrive at their respective windows at the same time to check the weather. They would look out, see the grey sky or the rare blue one, and nod. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible across the distance, but it was a greeting that carried more weight than a handshake. They were bound to one throne, the iron fire escapes that ran down the sides of their buildings. In the cramped apartments, the air often grew stale, especially on Sundays when the factories were silent and the city seemed to hold its breath. The fire escape became the only place to breathe. Arthur would be the first to step out, sitting on the metal landing with a book. Eleanor would follow a few minutes later, carrying a cup of tea. They never spoke. To shout across the airshaft would have broken the spell, would have invited the scrutiny of other neighbors, and disrupted the delicate balance they had found. So, they sat in silence, surrounded by the hanging laundry of the tenants' bellow white sheets, snapping in the wind like the sails of ships docked in the harbor. They watched the city together from their perches. They saw the ice wagon come down the cobblestone street, the horses' hooves clacking. They watched the children playing tag in the alley, their shouts rising up like smoke. They saw the shift of seasons, the arrival of the first crocuses in the window boxes of the third floor, the graying of the sky before a storm. Arthur found himself looking forward to the sight of her blue coat, the way she would tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear when she was thinking. Eleanor found comfort in the sight of his bowler hat resting on the railing, the steady rhythm of him turning a page. They did not know each other's histories, their fears, or their dreams, but they knew each other's peace. Love, in this great, sprawling metropolis, was rarely a grand gesture. It was not a balcony scene, or a dramatic rescue. It was the endurance of routine. It was the decision to keep the light low when the other was tired. It was the patience to wait for a nod that might not come, to sit on the cold iron of a fire escape just to be near another human soul. They were lovers by fate, two solitary people who had found a reflection of themselves in the brick and glass across the way. The years moved forward, the city changing around them. The automobile began to replace the horse. The electric lights began to outnumber the gas lamps. The war in Europe ended, and the city roared into the 20s, a time of excess and noise that seemed to penetrate even the thickest walls. Arthur received word from his firm that they were relocating their main office to Chicago. It was a promotion, a chance for a better salary, a life with more space and less soot. He was told he had 2 weeks to pack his life into boxes and leave the tenement that had been his home for a decade. He did not celebrate. The news sat heavy in his stomach. He walked into his room that evening and looked at the window across the way. Eleanor was there, as she always was, mending a shirt by the light of her lamp. She did not know that the world was about to shift. Arthur spent the next few days in a daze. He went through the motions of his work, clearing his desk, handing over his ledgers. He bought a trunk. But he could not bring himself to tell her. How could he? They had never exchanged a name, let alone a confession. To shout across the airshaft, "I am leaving," would be an invasion of the pact they had made. It would demand a response she might not be able to give. The night before his departure, the city was uncharacteristically still. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of rain. Arthur sat at his window, the room bare except for his chair and the trunk. He did not read. He watched. Eleanor was at her window. She was not sewing. She was looking out, her gaze fixed on the fire escape railing where he usually sat. She seemed to sense the absence before she saw the cause. She looked up, her eyes finding his in the dim light. For the first time, the silence felt brittle. Arthur stood up. He walked to the window and placed his hand on the glass. The separation was maddeningly thin, yet impassable. Eleanor stood as well. She saw the trunk in the corner of his room, the shadows lengthening across the floor. She understood the language of objects. She saw the hollowed-out space of his life and knew what it meant. She did not cry. She did not wave frantically. She simply pressed her hand against her own window, aligning her palm with his, separated by the brick chasm, and the 20 feet of air that had been their entire world. They stood like that for a long time. Two ordinary people in a city of millions, connected by a silent acknowledgement of what had been and what could never be. It was a love that had no marriage, no children, and no future. It existed only in the shared moments of the past 10 years, in the nodding at dawn and the sitting at dusk. It was a love defined by distance, protected by silence. Arthur lowered his hand first. He bowed his head, a gesture of respect, of gratitude, and of goodbye. He turned away from the window and extinguished his lamp. The room fell into darkness. Across the way, Eleanor watched his window go black. She stood there for a moment longer, her hands still against the cold glass, feeling the residual heat of the day. Then, she turned back to her room, to her own life that would continue in its rhythmic, unchanging way. The next morning, Arthur walked down the 4 flights of stairs, his trunk bumping against the railing. He stepped out onto the busy street, joining the flow of commuters heading toward the ferry. He did not look back at the building. He carried the memory of the airshaft, the fire escape, and the quiet girl with the tired eyes, tucked away in the ledger of his heart like a closed account. Eleanor woke to the sound of the milk wagon. She went to the window as she always did. The room across the way was dark and empty. The curtain was drawn. She stood there for a minute, absorbing the quiet. Then she opened her window to let in the morning air. The city noise rushed in: car horns, vendors shouting, the rumble of the elevated train. It was just another day. She dressed, pinned up her hair, and went to work. The city moved on, indifferent to the silent romances played out behind its brick facades. But in the history of that building, in the dust that settled on the sills and the shadows that stretched across the courtyard, there remained the ghost of a connection. They had been enemies by proximity, strangers by circumstance, and lovers by the quiet, unspoken fate that binds to people who truly see each other in a crowd. They had shared a throne of iron and brick, and now one sat on it alone, while the other walked into the vast, open, unknown, carrying the silence with him.